Kathleen Fallon is the Syria Campaign Senior Humanitarian Advocacy Lead. She's speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Here at The Struggle, we've been calling for the breaking of the sieges in Syria for some time, in particular using the slogan, "Drop food, not bombs." But the only city where that is getting airdrops is an Assad-controlled area under siege in ISIS. Last week I contacted the World Food Program about this. Their spokesperson, Gerald Bork, told me there's no airdrops to cities under Assad sieges because in these areas there are no large safe drop zones, and also that overland food deliveries had been done in July, implying that truck deliveries were taking care of feeding people. So, Kathleen, what do you think of this explanation?
Well, I think two important things. One, on the second point of truck deliveries of what's termed as cross-line humanitarian convoys going into besieged areas. There's different accessibilities for different besieged areas, but all of the areas under siege are in dire need of humanitarian assistance, particularly protein and nutritional foods, as well as medicine. There's right now an estimated between 1.1 and 1.9 million people under siege. This is far above what the UN estimates, but those are the estimates from local populations. And they're desperately in need of humanitarian assistance by the quickest and most reliable path possible. Cross-line humanitarian convoys with trucks is most efficient and most effective, but that's not the only possible ways to achieve access. And we're calling for the besieged areas to be granted humanitarian access the best and most efficient and effective and practical ways possible, as well as I think it's also important to mention to have immediate medical evacuations from besieged areas, which in most cases are also not being granted. And many people are dying from preventable diseases and preventable causes because they're just not able to have the medical assistance necessary in places under siege.
Now, in Madaya, they did get some deliveries, but it wasn't very satisfactory. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Madaya's been under siege for about a year and a half now, and it's under what's arguably the tightest siege in all of Syria. It's surrounded by over 12,000 landmines and 65 checkpoints with Hezbollah snipers manned. So unlike many besieged areas, like for example in East Ghouta, where there are informal access paths and underground tunnels and in other ways, there's really no way to get humanitarian assistance into Madaya except with official aid convoys. And the most recent aid convoy entered Madaya on September 25th, and it was not based on local needs assessments. It was not based on what was prioritized or most needed by local councils and the local medics that staff the one field hospital that treats over 40,000 people. And so in this convoy, there were about 200 bags of rice, as well as flour and some other foods that were, again, not the priority. And in the 200 bags of rice, the majority of them were mixed with shards of glass, and also animal waste. And this is...
Where would that have come in?
This was, of course, this was going through government and government ally checkpoints manned by militias.
So the contamination probably came in through there.
Exactly. When convoys go through checkpoints, there's a pattern. It's really a strategy of removing things as well as messing with things. This is not the first time that there have been other instances where bags of food have been mixed in with salt and mixed in with each other, making them inedible. There's a strategy of removing medical assistance from cross-line convoys. No surgical supplies are allowed into any of the besieged areas, and even things like baby formula and baby milk are habitually removed from convoys.
Now, what about the business of the airdrops? I mean, I was kind of surprised with this explanation that they don't do airdrops in Syrian cities controlled by opposition forces because there's no large, safe drop zones. They said it with Deir ez-Zor that there was an area basically the size of a U.S. football field, and they dropped stuff there. I mean, doesn't it sound a little strange? There's no other places in Syria where they could do the similar kind of drops.
Mm-hmm. And that is something that's been said for quite a while by the UN. That's only one part of the explanation that UN agencies use to explain why they are only using airdrops in Deir ez-Zor as opposed to other areas. I think that the number one reason is that the UN seeks permission from the Syrian government before conducting any cross-line either airdrops or even humanitarian convoys. They need the explicit permission of the government before conducting any of the humanitarian assistance missions. I do have to say that from a humanitarian perspective, operationally, there are logistics that can pose problems for airdrops. They could theoretically hit a building or a person. So, of course, humanitarian safeguards for airdrops are needed, and typically they do need an empty space like rural areas. But at the same time, these are challenges that I do not think have been explored in full with all of the besieged areas in Syria. Again, there's almost 2 million people under siege. There's many areas of Syria that are besieged by the government, as well as some areas that are besieged by rebel groups. And as you pointed out, Deir ez-Zor is besieged by both the Assad regime and ISIS. So I think it is very critical that the UN explores in full their ability to safely and immediately provide airdrops to populations under siege in areas like Madaya, like Aleppo, like East Aleppo right now. We were just speaking to the Syrian civil defense who work in East Aleppo, and they've said that there's between 12 and 15 days of food left for many people there. So starvation leading into the winter in particular will be a huge issue for the population of East Aleppo unless there's humanitarian access granted immediately.
Tell me about the group you work for, the Syria Campaign.
Sure. The Syria Campaign is an independent advocacy organization, and we work to elevate the voices and the demands of Syrian heroes. So we work very closely with the Syrian civil defense, the White Helmets, and then we also work with medics and health workers in Syria, as well as other Syrian civil society organizations. And we work with them to, again, elevate their demands for civilian protection and the release of political detainees, as well as ending the sieges and providing unhindered access to populations under siege.
There are some, though, who darkly accuse your group of being a slick outfit creating propaganda to encourage U.S. military intervention. I'm sure you've seen those charges. What do you say to that?
We work very closely. I mean, we're extremely proud to work so closely with Syrian civil society organizations, and we're proud to be in partnership with them. And I think that it is essential to again elevate the calls of these important organizations at all policy and media levels. And so that's something that we do. And these are not organizations many of these organizations are non-political and they're all humanitarian and human rights focused. So we're proud to stand with those organizations and echo their demands. Right now, the key demand is for civilian protection inside of Syria, and many think that the that the U.S. and European Union countries are essential partners in working to ensure that that civilian protection from the bombs being dropped by the Assad regime and by its allies, primarily Russia, is essential.
I hear today that the long-dreaded Russian major air assault may be beginning, and Trump and Obama seem uninterested. Is there something that can be done?
Yes, I think that in the last 24, 48 hours in particular, there have been heavy airstrikes have resumed on East Aleppo. So many airstrikes to the point that the civil defense have been unable to count them over the last 48 hours. And it's now, of course, not just East Aleppo, but rural Aleppo has also been under a major air assault. There have been 3 hospitals in the last 2 days that have been bombed. Medical workers have been injured and killed. Syrian civil defense centers, white helmet centers have also been bombed in the last 48 hours, as well as markets and other places of civilian infrastructure. So the Russian assault the Russian assault again has certainly begun. And in terms of what is needed, I think that the Obama administration will be here for another month and a half or so, and it's essential that there's tangible and immediate pressure on Russia in particular to halt their air assault on East Aleppo and all of Syria. One of the really tangible ways that this can be, that we think there could be such pressure exerted, is economically through increased sanctions. And there's actually a bill that's being put forth on the House floor today called the Caesar Civilian Protection Act, and this bill calls for increased sanctions on those that enable human rights abuses in Syria, and it also calls for increased accountability measures against those who perpetuate human rights violations and war crimes.
And so the campaign is urging people to support that bill?
Yes, we would very much urge all members of the House of Representatives to vote yes for that bill. It has right now, I believe, 83 co-sponsors, which is an enormous amount of co-sponsors. And we're very much hoping that it'll pass the House today and that it can be put forth in the Senate as well. And this is something that we think is really critical that happens over the next month and a half to 2 months while the Obama administration is still in power.
Well, thank you very much for speaking with me.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for focusing on this topic.